All right, I think we will get started. So welcome everyone to this chemicals network discussion. I am Andrea Rother. I am a professor and head of the Environmental Health Division at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. You are all most welcome to our discussion today that will be on climate change and chemicals. But just to ground us a bit. So this is the chemicals network of the Division of Environmental Health at the University of Cape Town, where we are having our discussion forum, which is being funded by Sweden through the Swedish Chemicals Agency. I'd also like to introduce you Eunice, who's in the background with technical support. We also have a WhatsApp group. The link is on the screen. You can join, the link is also in the chat. You can click on that and join the WhatsApp group. If you have any technical issues, please do feel free to use that. You may also continue to introduce yourselves in the chat with your name, country, and organization. So the Chemical Network Discussion Forum is really been put together to bring representatives from different regions, sectors, and stakeholder groups together to have discussions and to foster a mutually supporting consortium of stakeholders where we can look at different issues related to chemicals. And today, of course, we're looking at climate change in chemicals. We also look at trying to build the capacity of regulators, researchers, NGOs, and others that are working in low and middle income countries, and to discuss emerging issues such as climate change and chemicals. And we hope to achieve this by learning from each other today and sharing information and data, perhaps identifying some gaps and problem solving, really to look at reducing and preventing chemical poisoning and environmental contamination with a view to a toxic-free future for the next generation. So if you haven't joined us before, this is not a webinar, but a chat discussion. This is a non-partisan group, which means we may not agree with each other, but we will respect each other's viewpoints. The discussion will take place in the chat. So we have 3 presenters today, and each presenter will be giving an introduction and then lead us into a question that we will discuss in the chat room. There will also be some poll questions from time to time. Everyone will stay muted and have their video off except for the speakers. So I will now proceed to introduce our 3 presenters for today. So we have Dr. Shari Kovacs, who is an associate professor in the Department of Public Health and Environments and Society at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She is the knowledge mobilization lead for the Health Protection Research Unit in Environmental Change and Health. She has a PhD in environmental epidemiology, and her research focuses on health impacts of climate change, as well as developing adaptation options at the national level. Shari, you're most welcome. Our second speaker will be Dr. Owen Martin, who is an associate professor in health and environment in the Department of Arts and Science at the University College London. She is building on an academic interdisciplinary background in both natural sciences and social sciences, and her expertise lies on the integration and translation of both fundamental and observational scientific evidence into policy. Owen, it's nice to have you back. You're most welcome. Our third speaker today will be Dr. Claudia ten Have, who is the Senior Policy and Coordination Officer at the Secretariat for the Minamata Convention on Mercury, which is being hosted by UNEP. And her work has been focusing on global development, environment, and sustainable development challenges. She is a political scientist and holds a PhD in public administration. Claudia, it's nice to have you part of the team. So, if you have just joined us, please do continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. And in the meantime, I will now hand over to Shari to take us through the first question.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for inviting me to this important discussion session. I'd just like to say that my background isn't in chemicals, so please forgive me if I say anything incorrect, which is quite likely. My background is in climate change risk assessment and epidemiology of extreme weather events. So I've got 2 slides just to introduce you to climate change. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the concepts of anthropogenic climate change caused by carbon emissions, fossil fuel combustion, and it's basically changing the climate quite rapidly, more rapidly than what we were anticipating. So clearly increases in temperature are occurring in all contexts. But one of the other more significant impacts is an intensification of the hydrological cycle. So that means there will be an increase in intense rainfall events. And that does have implications for, remobilization of chemicals and for flooding. So the risk of flooding is likely to increase. And of course, there's also sea level rise, which will lead to coastal erosion, loss of land, and of course, coastal flooding. You can just see on here the reasons for concern. So it's not just the kind of rate of change we're concerned with, but also kind of irreversible effects and also extreme weather effects. And sort of kind of thresholds within the climate system and the distribution of those effects as well, because people won't be equally affected. And next slide, please. So climate change is quite complicated, as you'll find out today, and I know you've had discussions on this previously. There are multiple ways by which climate change will affect health. So I'm primarily going to talk about the sort of right-hand mechanism where the climate change causes local and regional changes, such as more heavy rainfall events, and then how that directly affects our health, and then what strategies we can put in place to address that, which is the adaptation policies. But climate change will also have important impacts on people's income and livelihoods. So we'll have important social economic consequences. But later speakers are going to talk more in the area of the left-hand side pathway, which is how climate policies may affect our health. So there are adaptation policies in the health sector, adaptation policies outside the health sector, for example, how we make sure our infrastructure is resistant to extreme weather. And these mitigation policies, so all the policies that address carbon emissions, so decarbonisation, which are likely to have significant co-benefits for health as well, for example, through reducing air pollution. Next slide. So what I'm particularly talking about is this scoping review that we're undertaking. So this is very much a kind of risk assessment, and it came because I've done several kind of national risk assessments, and there was a bit of a gap regarding chemicals. So we've undertaken a kind of scoping review of the published literature. So I appreciate this is limited to journal papers, and a lot of flooding and chemical events won't be captured in journal papers, but we thought it would be a good approach to see what the sort of evidence there was. So these are the questions that we're addressing. It's a global review. We're searching both health and environmental and other databases. And we're trying to basically see what we know so far about the pathways by which flooding events, heavy rainfall events are affecting chemicals, essentially chemical human exposures. Next slide, please. So we're very near our finalising this review, and so far we've got 131 papers, and there are roughly 4 different types of studies that we're interested in. The majority of this sort of second type, where it's environmental monitoring, so they're essentially looking at chemical compositions or the chemical or the risk within flood water or stormwater or runoff after a flood event. So generally a one-off type of research project, but occasionally there's some kind of continuous modelling. There are very few also epi studies where people have looked at personal exposures, so mapped exposures to people for chemicals or heavy metals. And then a few studies have also mapped and modelled the risk of flooding in relation to chemical sources. And finally, there are also an increasing number of papers that also look at future flood risk and how climate change may affect contamination, for example, through exposing landfills, through sea level rise, for example. So just some very preliminary sort of results, as you might expect. Most of these papers are focused on urban populations, and there's a real lack of evidence from rural populations in relation to pesticides, for example. Most papers are from high-income countries. A third roughly are from the US, and a lot of those focus around hurricane and tropical cyclones. And then from Europe, they're largely focused around river flooding. Next slide. So this is my final slide. So just to give you some idea of what we found in terms of these papers looking at stormwater and urban runoff. So as I've said, they're primarily looking at urban populations, or urban areas, I should say, but very little in terms of actual exposures with people. So very few studies of dwellings have been contaminated with chemicals associated with floodwater, and one paper looking at a schoolyard. And in terms of chemicals, again, it's a focus primarily around PAH and heavy metals, arsenic, and then a few papers also on microplastics. Next slide, please. Andrea, I don't know if you want to introduce the question or if I do it.
Either way, doesn't matter.
Okay, so our overarching question is about what are the key concerns for you, for the country you work in, regarding flooding and chemical contamination.
So we'll move into the chat now to discuss this question, but also if you would like to ask Shari any questions that may have been stimulated from the systematic review that she presented, please do feel free to post your questions in the chat as well. Shari, you're welcome to keep your video on and your mic on if you like, and you can respond to comments and questions that are in the chat.
Okay. I can't see any questions in the chat, so perhaps we should move to the first question on Mentimeter.
Sure, we can do that. So we can put the first poll up. In the meantime, people can continue responding to the question. So if you'd like to respond to this poll question, there is a link in the chat for Mentimeter. You just click on that and you can respond to the question. Thank you. Remember, if you do respond to the poll, or if you write a question in the chat, to please include your country. It does make it a bit easier. So you can see Debbie from South Africa has indicated impacts on drinking water quality. Perhaps, Debbie, you can indicate where your information or experience is from.
Okay, so there's a few comments regarding an experience in Iran. Yeah. So flooding impacts vary quite widely. Sometimes there's infectious disease outbreaks, of which I think there's been a systematic review on that, but there's been very little looking at flooding in terms of chemical contamination. They're very interesting comments. So one a comment from Tom Murray. So if you're trying to do a risk assessment for a flood, for example, if you don't know what is being stored, then you can't, that will certainly limit your ability to manage the risk when there is a flood, for example. Okay. So there's clearly a lot of experience of flooding and chemical contamination. Okay, so there's clearly an issue around storage of waste. So that's part of the risk management strategy. I still can't see any questions, Andrea. Am I missing something?
No, at this stage, it's mostly comments. So there's both comments in the chat and there's comments on the poll.
Is there a way to just keep the comments on Mentimeter to store them?
For after the chat, they will be stored, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, no, we will definitely have them. So people are still responding to question 1 in the chat as well. Shari, before we move on to the next poll, would you like to make any comments, general comments of what you've seen posted?
Yeah, no, it's just really, really interesting. I'm just reading them all because there's kind of quite a wide variation, I suppose, in contamination. And a lot of it, of course, does depend on how well, hazardous waste or chemicals are stored, routinely, I guess. So if you have got a problem with them not being stored very well, then they're highly vulnerable if there's a flood or even heavy rains. And also the lack of monitoring. I mean, if anybody's got any reports on these, or they've got a published report or a paper that we could link to, that would be really helpful, but I'm not sure. I think there's an issue that a lot of these events don't get written up.
Yeah, and particularly in low and middle income countries.
Yeah, so there's kind of lessons lost, I guess. So in terms of flooding, I've got this. What is the main risk of human health when it comes to exposure to chemicals? That's a really good question. And I'm not sure I can answer it actually, because you know, I guess it does depend a lot, because there could be, I don't think we've found any instances of really hazardous chemicals being mobilized. So there's a range of risks, I guess. Heavy metals, PAHs, and probably POPs as well. Are probably the key ones. But in the UK in particular, there's a legacy of contaminated land. So a lot of hazardous waste sites are not marked. And some of those are in coastal areas. So there are a lot of concerns that sea level rise or flooding will expose people to this hazardous waste that they didn't know was there.
So there is another poll up if you would like to respond to it, and the link is in the chat. Please do put your country in when you respond to it. Thank you. So we're asking you, what key organizations do you think are involved in chemical hazards during a flooding event? Thanks.
So there's a question now about a scenario where risk mitigation measures prioritized over resettlement or supply of food and waste. I haven't so much in the UK, but I'm sure there are others present who may have more relevant experience.
My apologies, I just realized this is a word cloud, so you don't need to put your country. I see some of you are putting your country, which is fine.
I think flood responses are always multi-agency events.
Shari, who are the agencies in the UK that are involved?
So under the Civil Contingencies Act, there's a process called the Local Resilience Fora, where a lot of the emergency planning takes place. So all the kind of frontline emergency responders would be there. But there would also be, in terms of the chemical hazard, there's a chemicals team within the health protection, well, the UK HSA now. So that would be the UK Health Security Agency. They would probably, so there'd be a central response to advise about the chemical contamination. So essentially, and then the Environment Agency would need to be involved as well, because there would be the chemicals in the environment, obviously, which have implications for wildlife. And
So what you've seen in terms of the responses in the chat to the first question around what are the key concerns for flooding and chemical contamination, are you seeing sort of similarity with what is in the UK? Are you seeing differences?
some similarities. I mean, the food thing's very interesting. So people mentioned food risks and drinking water. So I think there's a whole additional set of risks in some settings as well. So we've got very little information in the UK about any kind of the pesticide risks. It's very interesting. So it's clearly a very complicated response as well. And then there's, you know, there's the emergency, there's the acute phase, but then who would be involved in terms of follow-up? Because if there is chemical contamination, there clearly needs to be some monitoring after the event, and whether that's actually implemented in some areas or implemented as much as it should be would be interesting. So when we had a workshop in the UK with some of the people who'd managing flood risk, there wasn't any sort of additional guidance about managing chemicals within a flood risk. It was a bit of a gap, or a knowledge gap. So it'd be interesting to see if any countries do have this or specific guidance or planning.
So Shari, before we move on to the second question, would you like to give any other summing points, either of the poll or what you've seen in the chat?
No, just to say thanks everyone for those really important examples of flooding where you are. I think that's kind of opened our minds to a bit more of the mechanisms, and it's also helping us to understand where the gaps are, because there's clearly several kind of pathways in there that hasn't come out of the scoping review. So we can use that as sort of, it will help us to show where the gaps are.
Thank you. Well, we look forward to having the paper coming out, and we will definitely share it with the network once it's been published. So thank you for your time. We appreciate that. Thank you. We'll move on to Olwen now to take us through to the second question. Olwen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrea and Shari. So as Shari mentioned, we're going to move to look at some other links between climate and chemicals. And this time we're going to look more at the mitigation part and how climate policy and chemical policy may be related. Next slide. So the chemical industry is referred to as the industry of industries. chemicals sort of underpin most aspects of our modern lives in terms of the clothes we wear, the buildings we live in, furniture, how we transport ourselves, how we cure ourselves, etc. And there were, so chemicals were identified as a bit of a blind spot in energy policy by the International Energy Agency in their report in 2018, because actually petrochemicals are large consumers of fossil fuels, oil and gas. So they're currently the second largest after energy and transport sectors. But this is set to change as we sort of transition to less fossil fuel reliant modes of transport and energy. So this is set to then account to about 1/3 of the growth in oil demand by 2030 and about half by 2050. And the picture is very much the same for natural gas. The next slide. And the reason for this, if you sort of try to make sense of these complicated Sankey diagrams, is that most of the chemicals that we are using are actually byproducts of fossil fuels, particularly for food production, fertilizers called the natural gas, and for oil plastics in particular. Next slide. This is an industry that is set to grow. So looking when the Global Chemical Outlook 2 was being drafted in about 2017, this is an industry that's set to nearly double by 2030. And another point is that chemical production is sort of moving geographically from some of historical places in Western countries such as North America and Europe to primarily Asia, particularly China and India to some extent. The next slide, if we now think about how we can look at alternatives to this reliance on fossil fuels for the chemical industry, you'd have to look at alternative feedstocks. And there are some solutions there to some extent, primarily carbon capture and storage and producing chemicals from biomass. However, in terms of the volumes and the scale at which it's required, we're a long way far from there. And one way to look at what's happening there is to look at where investors have put their money in terms of these new technologies. And whereas there is a surge in the early 2010s, this has kind of stalled because there are all sorts of issues in terms of scaling up these technologies. Next slide. So if we were looking to shift from a fossil-based economy to a bio-based economy to produce most of the goods that we use, there's an example and little graph on the left. You can see that this is very complex and has complex implications on all sorts of other sustainable development goals beside greenhouse gas emissions. So there's this framework indicator framework that attempted to highlight all the different links between this shift to using biomass resource. And I think this was well exemplified when we with the shift to using biofuel instead of fossil fuel for transport and some of the consequences on land use, particularly for food security. But this also has impacts on biodiversity and all sorts of other impacts on health and other sustainable development goals. So this is a very complex picture. Next slide. Another aspect of that transition is looking at some of the sustainable technologies that are being developed that are set to develop some health co-benefits in some places, as Shari mentioned. So I'm talking about electric vehicles, wind turbines, all renewable energy technologies, which are, for example, if we're thinking of transport in large urban centers, are set to develop, deliver some health benefits in terms of air pollution. But these are massively reliant on on mining rare earth elements. This is a market that's heavily dominated by China, so it has geopolitical implications. And also it's sort of, again, displacing some of the pollution to a different type of pollution and to different places, because rare earth mining is not a benign operation. It has is accompanied when not done sustainably with all sorts of pollution regarding some of the waste, including radioactive waste, contamination of land, water, as well as some social impacts such as human rights and labor abuses. And these mining operations can also take place in places in the world where biodiversity is particularly important. So next slide, and I believe that's the final one. So this sort of whirlwind tour through some of these things is sort of trying to give some example and illustrate how, if we think of climate policy solely focusing on reducing greenhouse gas emissions for mitigation as the goal, we risk missing important opportunities for making this transition just and equitable, particularly if we ignore the chemical sector. And one of the few initiatives that I'm aware of, which is really much, I'd say, in an embryonic stage, is the European Union Chemical Strategy for Sustainability. Is the first time that I personally, so maybe you have something else to say during the chat, see an effort to look at the sustainable management or the sound management of chemicals beyond looking at just their safety, and looking at other aspects of their sustainability in terms of their impact on other sustainable development goals. That's it for me, so we can move to the questions. Thank you. So I don't know if you want to introduce the question or if you want me to do it, Andrea.
You're welcome to, yeah, it's fine.
So I think the overall overarching theme of this second discussion is about us thinking about the potential consequences of climate change policies on chemical pollution in your country. Yes, and I think Eunice has just posted question too.
Yes, and we'll see you all in the chat. Thank you. And also, if you have any questions for Alwyn, based on quite a lot of information that was presented, you're welcome to post those in the chat as well. See you in the chat room.
So I don't know if there's a Mentimeter as well. Maybe we need to move to the next slide. And the question two is, what do you think are the potential consequences of climate change policies on chemical pollution in your country? So yes, for the Mentimeters, do you have any examples of in your country of climate experts interacting or collaborating with chemical experts? And if you do have any questions, you can post them in the chat. I hope I've not overloaded you with too much or with too much information. Thank you for the person who's just, if you could indicate your country, that'd be, yeah, very useful. I think saying that if you don't have any example, do say so as well, because I think that would illustrate an important gap. So the question about no, I think the market is controlled by China, but they're being mined not necessarily on the Chinese territory. They may be mined elsewhere, and I'm sure there are many people that probably much more expert than me in the room in terms of the Chinese presence on the African continent, for example. So. Okay, so that's interesting to see that some of them are under the same ministry, but to what extent do they work in silos, or do they have opportunities to interact? Maybe if we want to reflect on whether we think chemical experts are aware of climate policies, and whether climate experts or policy experts are aware of chemicals, whether there's a direction in terms of those blind spots.
If you want to respond to the poll, there is a Menti link in the chat, which you can just click on. It's interesting to see that there seem to be some places where this is happening, or some of the synergies between the two areas are being recognized. And in terms of governance, that there seem to be a number of countries where this is under the same ministry, which hopefully should help some collaboration. What do I suggest for promoting more collaboration? I think the issue is starting to be recognized. I get the impression that chemical management is often seen as a separate silo from a lot of other aspects of environmental health. And it can be quite technocratic in terms of the way the risk of chemicals are being done. And I think some of these barriers need to be broken a little bit more. So some awareness raising, I think, is would be recommended. Although I can see that in some countries there are some
yeah, there are some initiatives that are taking place already, which is really encouraging. Yeah, I think we should. I mean, I know when we had the same discussion last year with SAICM, we asked the question, which is the UNEP of the strategic approach to international chemical management. And if I've understood the question, then the reflection was that they've never attended the COP, so there should be a session on petrochemicals. On chemical at COP. I don't know how we can put that on the agenda, but there should be some efforts to recognize these interlinkages, and for this to be an important. That's what I personally, and I'm biased because I work on chemical. What I believe is an important agenda item that should be on the COP agenda. If we are to make this transition. Yes, I would agree with, I'm not sure, Jane there. Yeah. I think it's interesting to see pesticides mentioned here as well, because if we are, there's a little bit of literature making this move to a bioeconomy, which I think really needs to be thought about carefully. And it may include higher use of some chemicals, such as agrochemicals, pesticides, fertilizers, etc. So that will be particularly important. Okay, so Adele, I'm not sure about the National Committee on Climate Change. If your national committee, if you could indicate which country you're from, it'd be interesting, has currently a representation of chemicals in waste, or if you think this is something that would be desirable, if it's not already happening. Yes, maybe I see someone mentioning plastic. Maybe maybe this is an area where there is some awareness of or a bit more maybe awareness of the linkages between climate policy and chemicals, which in the production of plastic and plastic waste, chemicals and waste, really.
Owen, do you want to make any comments on the poll post before we move on to the next one?
On the Mentimeter.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to follow the chat and the Mentimeter. Thank you very much for really engaging in this discussion. I think it's quite encouraging to see that there are some collaboration in some countries. I don't think that's the norm. There's also many people who are reporting that these things pretty much operate separately. So yes, I think there's something we can learn maybe from those where they're starting to see this type of collaboration and see how that's worked, what's worked well, and what may be some of the hurdles in terms of making that better integration work. Yeah, it'd be really interesting to capture all of these chat and comments to see that there is a mixed picture with some countries where this is sort of happening, and otherwise this is completely separate. As to the use of tools such as life cycle assessment as well, I think there are interesting things to be said there. So some of the life cycle tools are probably may have a bias. I don't know, that's probably a personal view, may have a bias within themselves in terms of more specifically targeting greenhouse gas emission. And I don't know if anyone in the room has experience or has views in terms of how well these life cycle assessment tools actually account for chemical issues. And that leads quite nicely to the second questions in terms of what initiatives exist in your country to address the impacts of the sustainability of chemical waste, other impacts of chemicals and waste on SDGs.
If you're not sure, you can always say that you don't know in which country, because I think that is also helpful information. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. So some of the chemical conventions, maybe which will be the next talk. Maybe we can sort of think about when thinking of chemicals, of the sound management of chemicals and waste, what is taken into consideration, which aspects, or do you think are well taken into consideration? There's interesting things here in terms of again in Kenya, some of the examples maybe where there's a lot more awareness globally of the issue, and because it's a very visible pollution issue, is that of plastics. With some example of voluntary initiatives by producers, as well as some legal instruments. Clean farm projects, which links, it's about how chemicals and obsolete chemicals are stored as well, I think, which links to some of the discussions earlier about some of the impacts of flooding. think I don't know why in my screen the Mentimeter is not scrolling anymore. So I think there's at least one comment that I may not be seeing.
Yes, I agree. It's on mine as well. Eunice, maybe you can refresh it.
Okay, yeah. Packaging and plastics comes up quite a bit. Which is interesting, and there may be things that can be looked at in terms of what has worked for plastic that may also work for other chemicals or materials. And pesticides. Maybe in the chat on the Mentimeter, with a few minutes we've got left, I don't know if you want to reflect on where there have been initiatives, what made it work, or what were specific barriers or hurdles that this had to overcome, whether it's for pesticides, agrochemicals, plastics, etc. Or how did it work? I think the Mentimeter is giving up on us. Yeah, so they are. I see something about lead in paint as well. Yes, thanks, Adele. I don't know if you want to be maybe more specific in terms of so there were institutional and legal reforms. I don't know if you give a specific example of what exactly had to what they consisted of. So a separate entity for chemicals and waste. Yeah, together.
Thanks, Alwyn. I don't know if you want to make any final comments before we move on to third question.
Thanks again, everyone, for really engaging with this question and giving your examples and initiatives. I think there is a mixed picture, but there are some examples that maybe we could learn about in terms of how to make that work. And I think some of the an area where this has taken place, maybe more specifically, maybe about plastics. So maybe there's something to learn there in terms of making that work more broadly.
Great.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for that. And we will be providing you with the transcript of all the polls and also the chat discussion. And just a reminder to everyone participating today that we do circulate a digest later on. That's a summary of the discussion. So thanks again, Alwyn, for your time and for taking us through and thinking about these important issues. And we'll move on now to Claudia. I invite you to, there you are. You can unmute yourself and you can take us through question 3. Thank you. So I believe you want everyone to respond to a poll while you start your discussion. Thank you.
Yes, I thought this would probably be a good way just to warm us into the world of conventions and agreements. So if you could go on the Mentimeter and indicate whether you know or that your country is party, in other words, is a member of this convention, works in this convention. Curious how that might spell out over the next couple of moments. And I see nice little balls or clouds appearing. I wish those were lotto balls and we could all win something, but here we see a lot of knowledge accumulating. Oh, I'm quite pleased to see a lot of Minamata parties. Of course, that's the convention I directly work for. But we're neck on neck with many others. So let me just give it a moment or two more. It's interesting to see that nobody says I don't know. So it does seem as if our world of conventions is quite relevant to this discussion group. But if you do not know, that's fine too. This is not a test question. This is simply to get an idea how you see, how you place yourself in the landscape. Okay, well, we'll see. I'm extremely pleased to see so many of you participate. Thank you very much. You might be Googling now if your country is indeed a party, but I can tell you that every country in this on our planet is a party to the Ozone Convention. It is the one convention that where we have global membership. It is really an achievement, and also we would like to say a testimony to the importance of the work that is done by the Ozone Convention. Minamata is, of all of these, the youngest one, so we are sitting at 137 countries that are parties. In fact, it's 136 countries and the EU that are party to the Minamata Convention. And Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm are a bit older than us and have been able to accumulate already more members. So, in fact, it is quite likely that you too are from a country that is a member or a party to perhaps all of our conventions that I'll speak about a little bit more today. So that might be a good place to go to the next slide. Eunice, if you could move us along. I'd like to just give a small background, and then there will be the question, which of course you've already seen in the handout, but just to locate ourselves within this landscape of different conventions. And Alwyn just mentioned, of course, the SciChem instrument, which does not appear here. And let me just say that, of course, SciChem is a very important instrument in our landscape of dealing with the sound management of chemicals and waste. I've simply not included it here simply because it is not a legally binding convention, but that actually does not mean that it's not equally important, and in fact is hopefully soon to be strengthened. So the one missing here is SciChem, but what I wanted to refer your eye to is just that we have a number of different conventions on chemicals, whereas we have our very big and very well known and also with very, very big membership, the UNFCCC, that is, of course, our climate convention. There's a C missing, I just see, because it is the UNFCCC. What I wanted to point out here, firstly, for those that are very, very close to some of these conventions, just the dates I've indicated here are the date when that convention entered into force, not perhaps the date the convention was signed, but this is really the starting day or the starting time from which this convention is actively working on implementing what it worked on, what it set out to work on. And secondly, I wanted to highlight that all of the conventions mentioned here, except for the Climate Convention, is a regulatory convention. In other words, it has a specific focus and usually a timeline and some measures against which countries oblige themselves to fulfill the goal of that particular convention. And that could be, as you know, wastes with Basel. Rotterdam is an information exchange. Stockholm deals with POPs, persistent organic pollutants, and then of course Minamata with mercury. But moving along to the next slide, I was asked to give you an introduction to a report that we have jointly produced. We, that is the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm Convention, and us, the Minamata Convention. We set out to make two reports, one on chemicals and climate change and one on chemicals and biodiversity. And here we have the one on chemicals and climate change, because we, as four separate but very much working together conventions, realize that if we are only in our silo of work, there would be quite a bit of opportunity lost to also contribute to the other areas of our work for the environment. And this comes very much also because our executive director, Inga Andersen, has been articulated that we face a triple emergency with regard to planetary boundaries and planetary stresses. In other words, climate change, biodiversity, and pollution. And while we have all of these conventions and other instruments that deal specifically with one of those areas, on the one hand, those that have been part of these conventions have often heard, oh, we don't deal with this, that gets dealt with somewhere else. And we don't do this because somebody else is doing that. So there's often a sort of almost legalistic and substance and substantive differentiation about who does what. But in that effort, while on the one hand it builds depth on a certain topic, in another way it also loses sight of some of the linkages amongst them and some of the interlinkages in particular. And that's why this discussion today is very interesting and important. And of course, that's also why we as secretariats decided that we needed to look at our own conventions and see what can we do that is part of the climate change agenda, what can we do more of, what should our parties be alerted to in terms of activities that they might already be doing, but that would also not only pay out for them in terms of their sound chemicals management, but also contribute to climate change mitigation or adaptation concerns. You see here in table 1, and that's one of the tables in our report, that it contains a look through different regional perspectives. And just looking at the names and the introductions, I see we have somebody from everywhere, whether it's Asia, Iran, or South America, Brazil. We have small island states. I saw Jamaica is here. There's also, of course, Madagascar. We have a number of persons from different parts in Africa, also from Europe. And so I would imagine you could look at this table and see some of what you are experiencing in your own national context right there, whether it's flooding or droughts or any other extremely high temperatures, etc. And what we did in this report is to, on the one hand, put some of the climate impacts on the one side of the table, and on the other, also look at what does this mean through chemical eyes. So you can have a look at that, but let me introduce 3 aspects briefly through the next slide. Eunice, if I could have the next slide. Yes. The one relates to the climate impacts on the releases of chemicals, and another is on the fate and transport of chemicals. But staying on the left-hand side of the slide first, we can see that there are the absolute effects from climate change on primary and secondary releases. And actually both previous PowerPoints and presenters nicely set up already what I'm referring to here in words, because on the one hand we have primary releases such as that there may be more or different pests and that might be that are noticeable in different parts of the world, which then go together with an increased use of pesticides. There are also more vector-borne diseases, or some that move to new places where perhaps older forms of control, such as DDT, might still linger or might be reintroduced. And so we have concerns around that. And then there might be, or there are aspects where some of the chemicals or the persistent organic pollutants or the metals such as mercury, but the others as well, there might be more volatilization of these chemicals, which makes them easier to move. The secondary releases, and you have seen this through many other reports and so on, of course, is that with melting glaciers or permafrost, that elements are being released, that with floods or difference in sea impacts and lake, whether lakes become bigger or lakes become smaller, we have chemicals that are water soluble moving in different ways or in more ways than previously seen. We have very high temperatures affecting chemicals, both their degradation, but also to release them and so on. And on the other hand, in terms of what happens once they're released, we see that climate change impacts the pathways both in air and also in water, whether that is through oceans or other water bodies. We see higher temperatures are making chemicals more volatile and able to transport over longer distances. And we see winds and other such aspects change and just carry items completely to newer places. I mean, just to explain that in terms of mercury, it is known that in the Northern Hemisphere, mercury moves into much higher, into jet streams and much higher elevations, and then deposits over the Arctic. But with a lot of these changes in terms of that we are seeing in terms of the major systems and the movement of systems and such streams, with climate change, we could be seeing these types of deposits actually changing their location. Moving to the next slide, in the report, there's also a section on, and today we already saw a number of examples that climate change affects infrastructure and operations. And here there are a number of items that directly relate to chemical and waste management, whether that's flooding or we saw quite a bit about that today, or it could also be in terms of the changes and disruptions in mines. We've seen, sadly, the breaking of tailings dams in places and all of the the hardship and the devastation that comes with that. And lastly, also, of course, that natural hazards can trigger particular technological risks that we need to be aware of. And here one only has to think about all the pictures we know from major hurricanes, but it's not only major hurricanes like Katrina or Ida or any of those that stick in our mind. They can also be maybe not so known, but equally devastating to the local population. And also in this report, and I've put that in the box, is that overall, as we are considering climate mitigation and reducing greenhouse gases and just moving ourselves to more sustainable production systems, all of that affects all of our sectors, but certainly also chemical production and chemical use. So then coming to the next slide, which sets up for the question, if we look at the current conventions here, and I will only really be able to speak for Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm, and Minamata, but why I put this up here is that I wanted to, in a way, just remind that while the Ozone Convention was set up for a very specific purpose, i.e. to preserve the ozone layer, and for a very long time has very actively and successfully helped countries phase out and replace ozone depleting substances, it became obvious at some point that HFC turned out actually to have, might be a good ozone, might not be harming the ozone layer, but in turn it is a powerful greenhouse gas. And so continuing in substitution with HCFC would not make sense, of course, because it would work completely counter to the climate imperative. And so we have in a convention, we have in the Montreal Protocol, the amendment, the Kigali amendment, so as to reduce these particular chemicals, and so that it in fact is now a climate imperative under a chemical convention, and hopefully, of course, with its implementation contributing overall to climate change mitigation. But now what's on the other side, and this is what I would love to see your responses to now, is What are the opportunities, whether it is for mitigation or adaptation from within the chemical side? And here we have the question, having considered some of the specific risks and issues and some of the macro ones more deeply during the discussion today, and as we now look at some of the UNEP chemical conventions, what do you see as most important to do at your level and in your specific professional and or national context on chemicals and climate change? The floor is open. I look forward to your reflections. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia, for taking us through that and linking it to the conventions, which is so important. We will be discussing this question in the chat, but given the time, we will also be posting 2 polls quite quickly after each other as well.
One of the things I've noticed is that there is no silver bullet. So it's probably not even fair to ask you what's the most important issue. There probably are more than one issue, but why this question seemed important to bring to you today is to know, where did it make click? Where is something that you see that needs to be done? Perhaps it's already being done and you want to do more of it, or maybe it's not yet being done and it needs some extra oomph to get us there.
Claudia, is this another word cloud?
This should be one. So
okay, yeah, so it's just words that people can post them, and if you like a word that's been posted and you agree with it, then post it again, and that'll emphasize it in the word cloud. Thanks.
it might be that there are few answers because the issue is not only relevant in one country, but elsewhere. It's just worded this way to know a little bit about your own context. I see in the chat some contributions from Guyana. Thank you very much. And also from Iran. And wow, I see the colors exploding with the cloud now. Yes. I see an echo also from many of the comments that we saw earlier, which coming forward. Thank you, Suresh, for your comment about the life cycle approach is an important one, probably not for any particular country, but all of us to think of together and how to bring that about. I must also say, Ahmad, from Iran, I feel also, of course, this weight that we feel we all have, and then the limited resources many countries feel they have to make a change, or the limited ability they feel they have to make a change at the higher level. It is important to know that we all have different capacities in different national contexts. And in many ways, that's why we argue for conventions the way we do, or major agreements, so that everyone would do their bit in the greater cooperation towards a common and shared goal. But it is a difficult journey. I must say, I like that I see emissions, of course, as the largest, because, and here I would imagine it doesn't only mean greenhouse gas emissions, but also, of course, chemical emissions, whether that's mercury or others. And thank you for somebody writing policy, because of course we need to bring together the good science and the actions and push the specific buttons. I see more. Blessings, thank you for talking about awareness. Knowledge is to make the link. And yes, it's true. Many thank you, many interesting contributions coming into this afternoon. And thank you, Helena, for making also the point about environmental rights-based approaches and the importance of legislation. I guess we need a bit of everything, and we need to work out how to do so many different things within a limited set of resources and within time constraints as well. That is our overall challenge. I see also there are contributions from South Africa and Brazil. Thank you so much for that. In some ways, the question now is how to move from greater awareness, including greater awareness of linkages, to actually action at the right place. How and who do we need to activate to make those links? I'm reminded of a cartoon I saw the other day, which was a big drum and inflows, ideas, inflows, SDGs, inflows, national regulations. And then there's a little tap at the bottom and it's closed and the water is flowing in and nothing comes out, and the tap is called action. Of course, that's a bit cynical, but our point is that we have to convert, we have to take these realizations, this knowledge and this understanding and translate it into actionable steps at the different national and, where necessary, global levels. Which in a way is maybe the clue for the last poll. Perhaps, Andrea, what do you think if we launch that one? And yes, just to, of course, agree with Frederick that we need knowledge, we need science, but we need that knowledge and science to be managed and to interface with policy to make it available for decisions to be taken that are actionable. This is our very major challenge. So with this last poll, who is your country's policy advice and implementation anchor on international management? And in a way, I guess the full question should read, and is this linked to climate change? But who in your country is the lead anchor for this, for chemicals management? And then if you know, it would be good to know if they are linked to climate. In some ways, this is mirroring a little bit one of Alwyn's questions, and we saw there in some countries that climate and chemicals are in the same ministry. Some countries have decided to really prioritize climate and have even specific climate ministries for that. And at times, the chemicals may or may not be in that actual ministry. But just in your country, who is the anchor of advice and implementation activities on chemicals management? So environment ministries. And I see government, is it, and who specific in government? Is it a specific ministry? Is it a specific agency? And regarding the cycle focal point, is that person themselves enabled to drive policy in their country on these issues, or is it more, is that person more a liaison with the process? I see also in the chat that Ministry of Environment tends to be the custodian of this topic. Yeah, I see Ministry of Environment coming up again in different ways. Zema, I think that must be Zambia, isn't it? Because I have seen some colleagues from Zambia on the call.
So we are
Andrea, over to you.
we're slowly running out of time. So I wanted to ask Claudia if you would like to make any final points before I conclude.
I would like to just amplify one, and it's Leonard Dock that said we need to create a positive story. I think it is important with all of this heaviness of things that are not going right, not to lose sight of the fact that we can still do something and that everything counts. And I think whether it is through discussions like these or different instruments we're in, we have to maintain that there are other options and that we can do something. So I would like to just underline the importance of maintaining that positive hope that we can, and we do have the ability, like we did in ozone, we do have the ability to turn the knowledge that we have into something better to act on. We just have to do it together. Thanks.
Thanks, and that's a nice point to conclude on. People who are attending today are representing different sectors and have different roles. And I think for many people, thinking about the kind of nexus between climate change and chemicals, and how do we bring those two topics together within the environments that we're working in, or the sectors that we're working in, it can be challenging. So I hope that everyone is leaving today with more knowledge, that they've thought about things, but also to think about what role, as you say, Claudia, what role the individual can play within the sector and in their work environment. So I encourage you all to continue this conversation and have the conversation with your colleagues. We will be sending out a digest summing up the discussion, and we encourage you to share it with others, talk to others, ask others to use the resources. I'd like to say thank you very much to our three presenters, very dynamic, and we covered a lot of topics in an hour and a half. A lot of preparation time goes into this, so thank you very much to that. Thank you to Eunice from UCT in the background, who was making sure that the technical aspects were running smoothly. You can see on the screen that our next discussion will be on e-waste and circular economy on the 20th of September. We have shared links for you to join the network. So if you would like to get more information or get the digest from today's discussion, please do sign up. Also, we have a newsletter that comes out. We ask that you sign up for that as well. And then just to, I think, Eunice, do we have one last poll asking people questions? There we go. So on the 18th of October, we're going to be having a discussion on risk communication and chemicals management. And if you can briefly think about it, what aspect you would like us to discuss, you could post it now using the Mentimeter link. It would be good to hear from you if there's a particular aspect in relation to risk communication and chemicals management that you're interested in. So thanks also to all the participants who were active today. And it was nice to see a spread from so many different sectors and countries. So thank you again. We'll leave the site open for a bit if you want to respond to this. And otherwise, I wish you all a good rest of your day or evening.